Hey, everybody. Today we're going to look at the rise of big business in the United States following the Civil War. In the era after the Civil War, politics were increasingly taking a backseat to new industries that would transform America. At the head of these industries sat some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in U.S. history. I'm talking about people like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan. Historians have long debated the legacies of the millionaire class that emerged after the Civil War. Some historians have looked at them as captains of industry, and they point to their entrepreneurial skills and their role in helping grow the American economy as positive influences on the United States. Others, however, look at these men as robber barons who used unscrupulous business practices to amass huge fortunes while neglecting their workers. In this lecture, I will examine some of the leading industrialists after the Civil War and look at why they've been cast as both heroes and villains in American history. One of the first major industrialists to emerge after the Civil War was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt had originally made a fortune in steamboating before becoming involved in the railroad industry. The Commodore, as he was called, was a self-made man who had leveraged a loan when he was 16 into a successful ferry business. However, Vanderbilt saw the railroads as the future of transportation, and in a surprising move, he sold all of his ships and invested in railroads just as the Civil War was coming to an end. He began by taking control of the New York and Harlem Railroad line in 1863 by buying up a majority of the stock in the company. Now, the railroads were the most important industry following the Civil War. More than any other industry, the railroads helped foster economic growth in the United States by linking up the different regions of the United States and allowing the raw materials in the West to be transported to factories in the East. However, the railroad industry that Vanderbilt was investing in was not unified. The rail lines connecting different parts of the country had been built in pieces, meaning that the railroad tracks were not standardized, and it made it very difficult to continuously travel across the nation without changing railroad cars. Vanderbilt began the process of consolidating the railroads by acquiring the New York Central line and then later the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railways. By 1870, the Commodore had created the largest unified railroad network in the United States, a network of rail lines that stretched over 4,500 miles. Now, by the time Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, he was one of the richest men in the United States, having amassed $100 million from his ownership of the railroads. His success helped propel the railroad industry and the American economy as well. For example, the consolidation of the Eastern trunk lines helped stimulate Western transcontinental railroads in the 1870s and the 1880s. Additionally, he helped popularize the use of steel rail for track, which made railroads both safer and economical. It also helped stimulate the steel industry in the United States, which would become critical to the Second Industrial Revolution. He even helped design and build the Grand Central Depot, which was not only an architectural marvel at the time it was built, but also employed hundreds of workers in its construction. Now, despite these accomplishments, the Commodore was also ruthless when it came to business. And this is kind of where that darker side comes in. He was willing to take drastic measures to ensure his own success. Like many other railroad magnates of the time, Cornelius Vanderbilt and later his son, William, engaged in unscrupulous business practices in order to increase profits. Railroad companies in the late 1800s began to form pools, which were agreements to divide the business in a given area and share in the profits. Additionally, railroad barons, such as the Vanderbilts, would often grant secret rebates to their largest clients, slashing the costs of shipping for the cargo of preferred customers, while at the same time, they would charge higher rates to smaller customers who oftentimes could not afford it. Small farmers were usually the victims of these pools and rebates, and ultimately drove them to organize against the railroad industry. Now, during the Second Industrial Revolution, steel replaced King Cotton as the most important product being created by the American economy. And the most important figure associated with the steel industry was Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant who first rose through the business ranks in the railroad industry before becoming a pioneer of the steel business in the United States. Carnegie saw the potential of steel in the changing economy, and he helped make the United States one of the leading producers of steel in the world. Steel was a wonder material. It was lighter, stronger, more flexible, and rust resistant, unlike its source material, iron. But it was also incredibly expensive to mass produce. That changed with the Bessemer process, which created a new method for mass producing steel in 1859. An English bullet maker named Henry Bessemer discovered that steel could be produced quickly and cheaply by injecting air into molten iron. Carbon and other impurities would be removed, leaving steel in its place. Carnegie utilized the Bessemer process to create a steel empire, which was centered in Pittsburgh. As a gifted businessman, Andrew Carnegie streamlined the production of his steel by controlling every step in the process. First, Carnegie owned the mines where the iron ore needed to make steel was first acquired. His ships then transported the iron across the Great Lakes. Next, his railroads delivered it to the blast furnaces in Pittsburgh. And finally, his massive plants used the Bessemer process to mass produce the steel and ship it around the world. Carnegie's complete control over the steelmaking process allowed him to cut out middlemen and improve efficiency in production. This technique, which Carnegie helped pioneer, became known as vertical integration. So the rise of the steel industry was essential to the Second Industrial Revolution because not only did it give jobs to a large number of American workers, but it also fostered innovation in construction, transportation, and mechanization. The development of skyscrapers and the movement to cities would not have been possible if not for the availability of affordable steel. The adoption of steel tracks in the railroad industry allowed trains to carry heavier loads of cargo safely. And it even led to the invention of new products such as barbed wire fencing, which would be pivotal to ranching out west. By 1900, America was producing 1/3 of the world's supply of steel, and Carnegie was responsible for a quarter of that, making him one of the richest Americans to ever live. In 1900, he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for over $400 million, a sum that would be worth today roughly $300 billion, probably maybe even more. So Carnegie's legacy, like the other industrialists at this time, remains controversial. There is no doubt that Carnegie helped build America into an economic powerhouse. Carnegie was also one of the largest philanthropists in the country, donating millions of dollars to different educational causes and helping to fund over 3,000 public libraries. Carnegie was a firm believer in the gospel of wealth, which argued that God had blessed some people with immense wealth. Because good fortune was a gift from God, he believed that the wealthiest Americans had a moral responsibility to use their riches for the betterment of society. Carnegie's detractors, however, point to the fact that much of his money was earned on the back of his workers, who were often overworked and underpaid. Carnegie often employed low-priced immigrants from Southern and Eastern European countries to man his steel factories, working in 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. These poor working conditions sometimes led to conflicts, and one of the most notorious instances was the Homestead Strike in 1892. In that instance, steel workers were upset over wages being cut, so they stopped working. The strike ended in an armed battle between the strikers, 300 armed Pinkerton detectives hired by Carnegie, and federal troops, which killed 10 people and wounded more than 60. Ultimately, the workers lost, but Carnegie's reputation was damaged in the process as well. Now, rivaling Carnegie's wealth and influence in the era was the oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller. The oil industry was just emerging as an important part of the American economy in the late 1800s. During earlier periods of time, oil was considered more of a nuisance than a profitable resource. That changed with the invention of kerosene in the 1850s, which became the first major commodity derived from petroleum. Prior to the invention of kerosene, many Americans used whale oil to illuminate their homes, but kerosene proved to be a much better fuel source, and it turned oil into black gold. Edwin Drake was the first person to successfully drill for oil using a steam engine in 1859. His oil derrick created a new booming industry within the United States. John D. Rockefeller saw a major economic opportunity then in this emerging industry. And so he opens up an early refinery in Cleveland, which turned the crude oil being drilled out of the ground into valuable kerosene that customers actually desired. So Rockefeller proved to be a cutthroat businessman who sought to squeeze out his competition. Rockefeller perfected the system of horizontal integration, which is the practice of dominating a specific phase in the steps of production. The goal of horizontal integration was essentially to grant the business a monopoly over an industry. And in the case of Rockefeller, he was able to take control of almost all of the oil refining in the United States. The way that Rockefeller did this was by creating trusts. A trust is a large-scale business combination in which one company grants control of its operations over to another company. Rockefeller created the Standard Oil Company and then ruthlessly went after his competition until they either went under or joined his trust. By 1877, the Standard Oil Company controlled 95% of all of the oil refineries in the United States. This is why, when we hear the word trust in history, we often associate it with the term monopoly. So Rockefeller's refineries did produce a high-quality product, and he was able to deliver his product at a cheap price because his control of the oil industry allowed him to improve efficiency in production and distribution. He even created several innovations within the oil industry, including popularizing the use of pipelines to transport oil. Like Carnegie, Rockefeller believed in the gospel of wealth, and he was involved in a number of philanthropic activities throughout his life. For example, he helped found the University of Chicago in 1892, and he chartered the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913, which continues to support medical research and educational programs even to this day. However, no other businessman in the United States was more closely linked with the ruthlessness of monopolies more than Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company. Rockefeller had a policy of rule or ruin when it came to his competitors, and he was able to defeat his rivals by securing preferential rates from railroad companies and influence over members of Congress. For these reasons, the Standard Oil Company was a major target of the fledgling antitrust movement, and for many people, the Standard Oil Company came to represent the problems associated with unchecked capitalism in the 19th century. So the financial giants of the late 1800s operated in an era very different from the one that we are in today. Post-Civil War America was a very business-friendly period in U.S. history, which some people have described as laissez-faire. Laissez-faire capitalism refers to the belief that the government should take a hands-off approach to business and economic affairs. This idea was popularized nearly a century earlier in Adam Smith's book titled The Wealth of Nations, and it was used by businesses in the Gilded Age to justify their ruthless business practices and prevent any government regulation of the economy. Going hand in hand with laissez-faire capitalism was the idea of social Darwinism. Social Darwinists viewed the business world as an arena where corporations fought with one another for dominance within the industry. Social Darwinism believed that the survival of the fittest ensured that those of superior ability and intellect rose to the top to become the greatest industrialists. For Americans who were trying to make sense of the huge fortunes being amassed during this period by a select few, the philosophy made sense. However, there were major problems in the attempts to justify the wealth of the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, and the Rockefellers of the world. First, the government was never truly hands-off. The government did play a role in the rise of business during this time period by providing subsidies to railroad companies and protective tariffs to American industries. The Transcontinental Railroad, for example, would never have been built if not for federal land grants and cheap loans offered to the railroad companies. Second, the survival of the fittest beliefs of social Darwinism often led to contempt for poorer Americans. Social Darwinism reinforced the myth within America that everyone could pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and that those that didn't must be either lazy or lacking ability. This myth still exists to this day, by the way, and the problem is that it discounts real inequalities that existed in American society, such as the nativism that was faced by many new immigrants coming to America, as well as the discrimination of the Jim Crow South. So for good or bad, business was the driving force in America during this time period. And these entrepreneurs reshaped the American economy. Whether or not you see them as captains of industry or robber barons, however, is ultimately up to you. Take care.